I'm Emily Schmidt, 42 years old, American citizen. For 6 years, I served as the chief automation architect at Arcadia Systems. I designed and maintained the infrastructure that handled every software update, payroll processing, and internal deployment throughout the organization. It was the kind of system that operates invisibly until it doesn't. The quarterly valuation showed $3.2 million in operational value. But its true worth exceeded those numbers because it functioned flawlessly, and that reliability existed because of my expertise. When they eventually discovered me in the server room, I wasn't weeping or screaming. I was laughing, that controlled, intentional laughter that emerges when your creation begins to assert itself and nobody around you understands the reason. By that point, intervention was impossible. The deployment pipeline had completely halted. Access monitoring systems were cycling endlessly, and status dashboards had frozen solid. Throughout this chaos, the only component still attempting communication was the server they believed they had disconnected from my access 48 hours prior. It happened on Friday at 6:47 p.m. The office floor was nearly deserted, most workstations already dark. I was heading toward the exit when I encountered him. Paul Granger, VP of Engineering, my direct supervisor for 11 months. The type of executive who offered handshakes only when others were observing. His manner of speaking was polished, precise, and self-assured, as though every request he made was already a foregone conclusion. "We require weekend coverage," he stated. "Critical deployments are scheduled. Monday's launch is high visibility." This wasn't a question, he simply waited. I met his gaze and responded with a single word. "No." He blinked once, not from surprise, but from annoyance. Like someone whose coin had been swallowed by a malfunctioning vending machine. "Pardon me," he said, though my response had been perfectly clear. I repeated myself. "No." My employment agreement specified 40 hours per week. My team had completed all assigned deliverables. There was no genuine emergency, only a manager who expected compliance from a professional who would no longer provide it automatically. His smile appeared, but it was the wrong type, too quick, too practiced. "Understood," he said. "I appreciate the clarification." That was the entirety of our exchange. He pivoted and walked away, humming some melody as if it carried significance. I remained motionless, watching his figure recede down the corridor. I felt no anger, no surprise. But I recognized that particular smile, the kind distributed just before something gets quietly removed. That weekend, I rested deliberately. I visited the cafe on 5th Street, reviewed technical documentation nobody had requested, and slept without anticipating the next move. I knew retaliation was coming, but I also possessed knowledge they lacked. The system they relied upon hadn't forgotten its creator. If you're still reading this, perhaps during your lunch break, perhaps while leaving the office as I did, document your presence. Tell me your location. Because some people shatter silence with noise, others with fury. But some of us construct something within that silence and allow it to wait. Monday morning, 7:58 a.m. My access card failed at the main entrance. I attempted again, red light, access denied. Slack account, disconnected. Email, address unknown. No meeting scheduled, no farewell gathering, no official statement. Just elimination. They hadn't terminated my employment in the traditional sense. They had simply erased my existence. Except the infrastructure they sought to control still recognized its architect. While they celebrated the quiet, it had already begun to respond. At 7:58 a.m., the badge scanner flashed red. I tried once more with identical results. The reader clicked, not with resistance, but with indifference. Access denied. I stepped back, retrieved my phone, and accessed the remote administrative panel. The corporate network refused connection. Network unavailable. Identity unrecognized. I had been removed from their systems, but the architecture couldn't forget its creator. Deep within the control logic, beneath the interface visible to others, a process awakened. It existed in no documentation, appeared in no ticket system. None of the office staff knew of its existence. But I did. I had written it months before they remembered to include my name in meetings. It wasn't malicious code. It was a decision embedded quietly into the infrastructure's operational rhythm. Every processing cycle carried a single assumption. If the architect vanishes without notice, secure all access points and wait. That morning, it executed exactly as designed. At 8:03 a.m., the first irregularity manifested, a slight delay in the reporting dashboard, a data request that stalled beyond normal parameters. An analyst might have noticed, might have attributed it to memory issues or queue congestion. But it wasn't random noise. It was the system posing a question, searching for someone no longer authorized to respond. By 8:05 a.m., the internal deployment process reached its scheduled activation point. It requested new instructions and received silence. It tried again, nothing. With each unanswered query, it began counting. 5 unanswered signals constituted the threshold I had established 6 months earlier. On a night when I'd been excluded from a promotion list for the 3rd time while watching them celebrate someone else's advancement, I stayed late. Not for revenge, not for sabotage, but for preparation. Because I understood this organization and individuals like Paul. I knew how they smiled while calling your work critical just before they edited the directory containing your credentials. So, I left something behind. Not malware, not destructive code, just a logic gate. A structure that said, if the core authentication fails to respond 5 consecutive times, halt everything. Not dramatically, not destructively. Simply stop. Require manual override from a single source, me. At 8:11 a.m., the alerts began cascading. I wasn't present to witness them. I was seated across the street at a cafe window, drinking something warm and unsweetened, observing through the glass as shadows shifted on the 4th floor. Figures leaning over workstations, expressions of concern, notification lights blinking. They were beginning to notice. Not the cause, only the symptoms. Internal communication channels ignited first. Is anyone seeing blocked status reports? Attempting deployment, but nothing's confirming. Where's Emily? Isn't she responsible for this? But Emily wasn't responsible for anything anymore. Emily was sitting calmly, watching a building she had fortified begin questioning why its pulse no longer synchronized. At 8:15 a.m., the finance team attempted to release weekly disbursements. Nothing processed. Payment systems had been integrated months earlier into the core job pipeline, one of my initial improvements. It streamlined approvals while listening to the same checkpoints, now searching for someone who had been deleted. At 8:19 a.m., Paul called. I didn't answer. At 8:21 a.m., he messaged, we're experiencing access issues. Come in, and we'll resolve this. I read it once and captured a screenshot, not for evidence but to remember the precise moment he stopped pretending. At 8:25 a.m., a second message. Did you implement some kind of security protocol? We're locked out. Respond immediately. Immediately. That word always arrives too late when consequences outpace explanations. I remained silent. I folded my phone, gazed through the window, and listened to the city's steady rhythm. Inside their building, panic was setting in. They believed they had eliminated me. What they had actually done was activate the one safeguard they never audited, because an architect's value isn't in the code, she writes while the team observes. It's in the decisions she embeds into the foundation, the ones that only matter when nobody remains to answer the call. By 8:32 a.m., the process had entered a recursive loop. On the surface, everything appeared manageable, just a minor disruption, a false start, a queue requiring clearance. But deep within the deployment system, the progress indicator had frozen at one message, repeating endlessly, awaiting architect authentication. The machine they thought they had silenced was asking the same question over and over. Where is Emily Schmidt? And Emily Schmidt was exactly where she needed to be, watching from a distance as 6 years of architectural expertise defended itself, one failed authentication at a time. Before my departure, I embedded something within the system, not malicious code or sabotage, but a simple logging mechanism. A safeguard that would halt all operations if the core authentication failed to respond 5 consecutive times. The shutdown would be quiet, requiring manual intervention from a single authorized source, myself. At 8:11 a.m., the alerts commenced. I wasn't present to witness them directly. Instead, I observed from across the street, seated by a cafe window with an unsweetened warm beverage, watching shadows move behind the fourth-floor windows as staff hunched over workstations, confusion spreading across their faces as notifications multiplied. The internal communication channels buzzed first with confused messages. Anyone else seeing blocked reporting logs? Attempting deployment, but nothing's confirming. Where's Emily? Isn't this her responsibility? But Emily was no longer responsible for anything. She sat calmly, watching the fortress she had constructed begin questioning why its pulse no longer synchronized. At 8:15, the finance department attempted their weekly payment disbursements. Nothing processed. The payment system had been integrated into the core workflow months earlier, one of my initial improvements that streamlined approvals. However, it relied on the same checkpoints, now searching for someone who had been eliminated from the system. Paul contacted me at 8:19. I didn't respond. At 8:21, he messaged, experiencing some access difficulties, but will resolve them shortly. I screenshot his message, not for leverage, but to capture the precise moment his facade began cracking. At 8:25, another message arrived. Did you implement any lockdown procedures? We're paralyzed. Respond immediately. The word immediately always arrives too late when consequences precede explanations. I remained silent, pocketing my phone and observing the city's rhythm while their building began to panic internally. They believed they had eliminated me, but what they had actually done was activate the one mechanism they never audited, because an architect's true value isn't in the visible code she writes, but in the foundational decisions she embeds, the ones that only matter when no one remains to answer the call. By 8:32, the system entered a recursive loop. Surface-level operations appeared normal, just a minor glitch, a temporary setback, a queue requiring clearance. The release dashboard glowed green, lights blinking optimistically, showing recovery in progress. But none of it was genuine. The system had activated the second phase of its fail-safe protocol. To inexperienced observers, it resembled restoration, as if someone had pressed the correct button, as if the team had resolved the issue before it escalated. But they were observing a simulation, a rehearsal of resolution. Their commands were being redirected. Their deployment scripts disappeared into a closed loop, and every success notification they received reflected an empty mirror. I watched the checkered shirt developer lean back from his monitor, nodding approvingly. From my window perch, I could see he had no idea his pushed code was never executed, that his production patch now resided in a vault I had constructed months earlier. This wasn't designed for entrapment, it was built for testing, to measure who would notice when the rhythm altered. The system wasn't programmed to crash, it was engineered to evaluate awareness during disruption. At 8:45, the quality assurance manager messaged the team, appears stable. Proceeding forward. At 8:47, internal channels flooded with relief. Back online. Thanks everyone for the quick response. Restarting my queue. At 8:53, Paul broadcast his morning announcement. All systems operational. Excellent work, everyone. I read this with an emotionless expression, not anger, just recognition. Paul had always excelled at timing rather than comprehension. He knew when to enter a room, not why the crisis had ceased. Now, positioning himself at the center of a situation beyond his control, he mistook echoes for applause. By 9:15, meeting invitations multiplied. Coordination calls, team huddles, a comprehensive review scheduled for 10 o'clock. Paul prepared his presentation, likely rehearsing how his leadership guided the team through unexpected disruption, how he personally analyzed the logs and coordinated recovery. While he spoke, the loop continued. No data reached the live environment. No releases passed validation. Every celebrated process was being documented, tagged, and archived in a hidden repository, not to expose anyone, but to observe how many would pretend nothing had occurred, how long the illusion would persist. This wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity. They hadn't fixed anything. They had bypassed warnings, and the system, uncertain whether its trusted operator would return, had entered a holding pattern, a shadow environment running parallel to reality, invisible to their monitoring tools. I called it the loop, a circle of confident emptiness, an illusion of progress engineered with precision. At 9:32, Paul called again. I declined. At 9:35, he messaged, if you build something requiring your authorization, we need to discuss this now. The phrasing was telling. If, still uncertain, still unwilling to acknowledge that what was failing wasn't just a system, but their assumption that I had ever been replaceable. At 9:38, the automation manager posted in the team thread, "Something feels wrong. Logs appear too clean." At 9:41, a junior developer noticed discrepancies in the sandbox environment, identifiers that didn't match production tags, task names slightly incorrect, enough to raise questions. He asked quietly, "Are we deploying to a clone?" No one responded. By 9:48, the UI build triggered again. The log registered success, but no changes materialized. Still, reports continued. Still, meetings filled. Still, Paul finalized his narrative. He stood before the glass wall, jacket removed, expression composed. I couldn't hear him, but I recognized that voice, the one that transforms silence into credit, that declares things fixed before understanding what broke. He would conclude with a smile, appear confident, never knowing that the only reason the system wasn't screaming was because it was still awaiting my return. By 9:52, I understood their mistake. They had confused silence with safety, interpreted success from indicators that only knew how to blink green, and assumed the system had returned to them like a recalled pet from darkness. They were pushing new versions now, rushing, cutting, patching publicly, unaware that the real environment no longer responded. But the ghost did. And I had given the ghost a place to record. It wasn't a backup or a trap. It was a secondary memory constructed quietly over the past year, a habit developed after witnessing too many projects collapse under misaligned intentions and retroactive modifications. I had created a vault not to harm but to preserve, not to punish but to prove, a quiet container accepting every change pushed into the system after the loop began. Every file, every configuration, every forgotten line of deprecated code accidentally reintroduced, all stored, all tagged. Not to destroy them, but to let them complete their own destruction. By 10:20, the first emergency patch had been pushed twice. One version included a deprecated workaround from 6 months prior. The other was missing access controls entirely. On any normal day, someone like me would have flagged this quietly, respectfully, in a private message rather than public thread. That was the culture: smooth over, then solve. But now no one was smoothing. They were celebrating. At 10:33, the release coordinator messaged the executive channel. "Recovery complete. No client impact." I read this while sipping water at the corner table, listening to nearby conversations about vacations and the sound of a dropped spoon. Across the street, my name still didn't exist, but my structure did, watching, not analyzing or correcting, just maintaining a record. By 10:47, the user experience team demonstrated their new interface update 3 floors up. I could see the presentation reflected in the glass. They were proud, and I didn't fault them. They were solving the wrong problem, but no one had informed them that the real system hadn't accepted a single instruction all morning. Paul had moved on, preparing for the 11:15 executive debrief, a closed-room recap for department heads and board members. A quiet success story with clean screenshots and a perfectly paced narrative of disruption, coordination, and recovery. At its center, himself. He had taken my absent silence and attempted to frame it as proof of his command. Still, the vault recorded timestamps, tracked inputs, mirrored chat logs where security validations were skipped for speed, archived moments when someone pasted live credentials into configuration files exposed for 63 seconds before being overwritten. Not from malice, just pressure. That was always how things fractured here. Not because someone despised rules, but because rules interfered with meetings. At 11:21, a junior analyst questioned in the support thread, "Why are error logs missing from today's sync?" The rapid reply, "Already resolved, visual bug." Not exactly a lie, but the kind of answer that sounds correct to people already moving forward. I leaned back, hands folded. The vault was complete now, filled not just with code, but with context, decisions, timing, names. Not for revenge, but for clarity. Because I knew what would follow. Paul would speak, the system would remain quiet, the board would nod, the team would advance, and no one in that room would ask who had actually prevented the collapse. But I would have the answer, not to use immediately, just to hold. Because the only thing more dangerous than a broken system is one that believes it has fixed itself. And the only thing more powerful than speaking aloud is waiting until silence becomes undeniable. At 11:14, the conference room door closed. Inside, behind soundproof glass with carefully arranged water, the meeting began. Labeled as a routine technical recap, internal systems review, 10 minutes scheduled, just enough time for Paul to deliver his rehearsed summary and proceed. No expectation of challenge, no anticipation of scrutiny. He had done this before. He entered with the calm of someone believing the worst had passed. Jacket buttoned, notes printed, voice carrying the measured confidence of someone addressing people unlikely to question the mechanics. For the first few minutes, no one did. He opened with familiar phrasing. We identified a brief automation misfire this morning tied to outdated credential caching. It sounded official, plausible, the sort of thing no one would verify. He continued. Our internal teams responded immediately. All production impact was contained. Redundancy protocols engaged as designed. Core deployment recovered without delay. At 11:17, I watched through a secure relay window, an old legacy interface never properly decommissioned. I still had access, not through force, but because no one remembered to remove it. That was always the gap. They removed names, not structures. Inside the room, Paul advanced to slide 3, Incident Timeline. It displayed a neatly formatted sequence. 8:03 detect, 8:07 respond, 8:32 validate, 9 o'clock resume. Green arrows were symmetrical, fonts precise. For a moment, no one interrupted. Then came a voice I recognized. Can we see the raw logs from the 8 o'clock cycle? Not a request, a test. The speaker was Jared Linwood, board member, former technical founder of a logistics firm that had once collapsed due to a similar incident. He had remained silent during the first half but now leaned forward, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. Paul blinked, smiled. We archived the logs during resolution. I can follow up with our infrastructure team. Jared nodded slowly, and those logs confirmed successful deployment to the live environment. Paul hesitated. Yes. Our indicators showed restored function by 9. That wasn't the question, and Jared knew it. A second voice entered, Susan Chong, head of risk. Can you clarify whether the validation step was run on the actual release pipeline or a staging simulation? Paul's answer came slower. The environments are mirrored for all functional purposes. There's no difference. But there was, and people like Susan knew where to listen for gaps. The room shifted. What had started as a summary began feeling like an interrogation. Paul moved to his final slide. What matters is that the system remains stable and we avoided client disruption. The words were correct. The tone was not. By 11:21, questions began overlapping. Why was no incident ticket filed? Why wasn't the automation restart timed? Who validated the rollback conditions? Paul answered where possible, deferred where he couldn't, and smiled throughout. But I could hear it. The edge behind words, the slight break between lines. Not panic yet, but calculation. A man updating his narrative in real time, hoping no one noticed the version shift. I didn't need to be in the room. The system was speaking for me. Every gap they questioned, every step Paul couldn't account for had been recorded, not by me, but by the archive still quietly collecting in the background. The vault he never knew existed, built not to punish but to observe.
And it was watching him now.
At 11:29, Jared closed his notebook. One last question. Who built the original pipeline configuration? Paul paused. Emily Schmidt. But that was years ago. My name spoken aloud for the first time all day. Jared nodded. Silence. That was the meeting's end. Paul gathered his notes. Board members filed out. No handshakes, no congratulations. Just quiet, delayed, heavy silence. Somewhere inside the building, the system continued looping, not because it was broken, but because it was waiting. At 11:37, I turned off the feed. I didn't smile or move. Just let silence return. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the absence of the one person who understood how it was supposed to work. At 12:04, a message appeared on the internal announcement board. Not dramatic, no urgent subject line or a red icon. Just a short, cleanly written note with the heading, Post-mortem observations from Parallel Archive, and below it, a single link. Not external or flagged, just a standard embedded address, a dashboard familiar to anyone in the building, a system they all used, a format they all recognized. No one questioned who posted it. It came from an address still whitelisted in the system, a name no longer on the team page, but whose access controls had never been told to forget. Some ignored it initially. Another recap, another set of retrospective slides, a summary someone compiled to wrap the morning's chaos. But those who clicked saw something else. The page opened to a timeline, not dramatic, no bold letters or colors or blame. Just facts. Timestamps with side-by-side entries. On the left, what Paul's report claimed occurred. On the right, what the system actually did. At 12:06, a junior engineer named Marissa clicked the link. Sitting in the third-floor open workspace, finishing a sprint summary, she read the first line, then the second. Then stopped typing. At 12:09, someone in finance clicked it. Then a compliance lead. By 12:13, the board had passed the link to legal, and by 12:19, the viewer count exceeded 40. The link didn't accuse, it revealed. Each section contained logs, cleanly formatted snapshots of configuration edits, credential placements, expired access controls. One section labeled Redundancy Misalignment showed the moment a critical fallback failed silently at 8:08. No error surfaced, no human noticed, but the archive had. Then came screenshots of internal chat logs, not taken secretly but from public threads. Comments dismissed or marked resolved by people in a rush. A line from 3 months ago, "No one uses the legacy trigger anymore, right?" Paul's reply, "Push it through. We'll clean up later." Below that, a chart, 47 pushes, 0 successful deployments, no rollback. Finally, the credential string, not redacted, committed by Paul in panic at 8:26 that morning.